Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time, way back, to an era of empires clashing, of grand palaces and grinding poverty, of power and brutality. Tonight you are going to experience, just a little bit, what it was like to be an Ottoman soldier. Imagine yourself not just on the battlefield, but right there in the muddy encampments, enduring the forced marches, feeling the bite of poorly made armor, and maybe, just maybe, getting poked by a questionable medical instrument. It wasn't exactly a walk in the park or even a brisk trot. Frankly, statistically speaking, you probably wouldn't have survived the experience long enough to collect a pension. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know down in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our journey into the suck starts not on a glorious battlefield, but in a quiet village, tucked away in the valleys of the Balkans. You're a young boy, maybe 7, maybe 12, maybe 15. The age range varied over the centuries, making it a confusing time to get a paper route, let alone drafted. You're living your life, probably tending sheep or helping in the fields, maybe dreaming of someday inheriting your father's small plot of land. Your world is your village, your family, the familiar rhythm of the seasons and the local church bells. It's simple, it's hard, but it's yours. And then one day everything changes. A dust cloud appears on the horizon, growing steadily larger. It's not the usual traveling merchants or a returning neighbor. These are Ottoman officials, maybe a few janissaries, the Sultan's elite soldiers, accompanying them. They arrive with an air of quiet authority, their presence heavy and absolute. This is the devshirme, the infamous child levy, or blood tax, a system that, for centuries, was one of the most controversial and feared aspects of Ottoman rule in Christian lands. Imagine the scene. The village elders gather nervously. Your parents grip your arm, their faces a mixture of fear and resignation. The officials, often accompanied by scribes, move through the village, their eyes scanning the young boys lined up, trembling before them. They're not looking for the strongest or the tallest necessarily, not yet. They're looking for health, intelligence, a certain resilience in the eyes. And crucially, they are looking for boys who have not been circumcised, a clear sign they are Christian, the primary target group for this levy. Mainstream historical fact number 1, the devshirme system was a unique method used by the Ottomans to recruit Christian boys from their Balkan territories and train them for service in the state administration or the elite military corps, the janissaries. It bypassed the established Muslim aristocracy and provided the Sultan with a loyal body of servants beholden only to him. The selection process is terrifyingly arbitrary from your young perspective. An official points. Your stomach drops. You see your parents' eyes well up. Maybe they try to protest. Maybe they plead. Maybe they just stand there, stunned into silence. But there is no arguing. This isn't a request. It's an imperial decree. You are selected. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. There's some historical debate about whether all Christian communities were subject to the levy at all times. Some records suggest certain regions or groups managed to obtain exemptions, perhaps through bribes or historical treaties. And in some extremely rare instances, desperate Muslim families might even try to present a son as Christian to get him into the system, hoping for the prestige and power service in the Sultan's court could bring, though this was highly illegal and dangerous. Talk about a convoluted career path. So, son, are you ready to potentially become a powerful administrator or one of the most feared soldiers in the world? Great. Now let's pretend you weren't raised praying the Shahada. You are separated from your family. You might be allowed a brief, tearful goodbye, or you might just be pulled away, joining a growing group of other terrified boys from your village and neighboring ones. This is it. Your old life ends right here. You don't know where you're going, what will happen to you, or if you'll ever see your family again. Spoiler alert, you almost certainly won't, not in the way you knew them. The journey begins. You walk, often for weeks or months, across rough terrain, sometimes in chains, sometimes just herded along. You're given basic food, probably not enough. You sleep in makeshift camps, cold and scared. The officials are firm, sometimes kind, often indifferent. They aren't cruel for cruelty's sake. You are valuable property now, destined for the Sultan's service. But they are also stripping away everything you know. Your name might even be changed to a Turkish one early on. Your language is useless outside this sad little band of recruits. Upon arrival at a collection center, probably in Istanbul or Edirne, you are formally converted to Islam. This isn't a spiritual awakening. It's a bureaucratic and political requirement. You are now part of the askeri, the military administrative class, bound by loyalty to the Sultan and the Ottoman state. Historians still argue whether the Devshirme system was primarily a brutal institution of forced servitude or a unique, albeit harsh, path to social mobility and opportunity for non-Muslims in the empire. From your perspective, a terrified kid ripped from his home, it probably felt a lot more like the former. You are given new clothes, learn basic Turkish commands, and begin the process of being stripped of your former identity. You are no longer Marco from the village in Bosnia. You are Mehmet, recruit number such and such, property of the Sultan, destined for, well, you don't know yet. But you're about to find out, and it's not going to be easy. So you've been taken, given a new name, a new religion, and you're bundled with hundreds, maybe thousands of other terrified kids who look just as lost as you feel. Your destination? Not the battlefield yet, thank goodness. First, you go through what's called the Asemi Olan period, meaning something like recruit boys or cadet youths. This isn't just military training, it's a complete system shock designed to break you down and build you back up into something new, a loyal servant of the Sultan. Think of it as the most intense, culturally immersive, psychologically draining summer camp from hell, but with way more forced marching and significantly less s'mores. You might spend this initial phase in various locations. Sometimes it was on Anatolian farms, working the land for Ottoman nobles or even the Sultan's estates. This wasn't agricultural vocational training. It was hard, back-breaking manual labor. Up before dawn, working until dusk, minimal food, harsh conditions. Why farms? It served a few purposes. It physically toughened you up after potentially a long journey. It immersed you fully in Turkish language and culture, away from other non-Muslims. And perhaps most importantly, it severed any remaining ties to your past life, family, and community. You were isolated, dependent entirely on the system that had taken you. You learned Turkish because no one around you spoke anything else. You learned Islamic customs because that was the only way of life permitted. You were being molded day by punishing day. Other recruits, potentially those deemed more intelligent or promising, might bypass the farm stage and go directly to the Asemi Olan barracks. These were not fancy places. Imagine cramped dormitories filled with bodies, the air thick with the smell of sweat, unwashed wool, and fear. Privacy is a concept you forget existed. Every moment is regimented. You are constantly supervised. There is no slacking, no questioning, no individuality. Your thoughts, your actions, your very being must align with the demands of your instructors. The physical conditioning is relentless. Long marches, often in harsh weather, carrying heavy packs, drills that push your body to exhaustion. Learning to use weapons, first basic swords, spears, and bows, later the terrifyingly loud and unreliable early firearms. You run, you fall, you get back up because not getting back up means a swift, painful correction from an instructor, often a veteran janissary who knows exactly how much pressure to apply. This was the kind of training that made you pray for bedtime, only to find bedtime was just a few hours of fitful, interrupted sleep before the whole brutal cycle began again. It's like being on a treadmill that only speeds up, and if you fall off, you get smacked with a stick. Fun, but the physical pain is often less impactful than the psychological conditioning. You are constantly bombarded with the message that your old life was inferior, that your Christian past is irrelevant, that your loyalty is now solely to the Sultan and the Ummah, the Muslim community. Religious instruction is mandatory and thorough. You learn the Quran, the rituals, the beliefs. This isn't just about conversion, it's about instilling a new identity, a new worldview. You are taught that the Sultan is God's shadow on earth, that service to him is a sacred duty. This training aimed to create soldiers who were fanatically loyal, highly disciplined, and utterly detached from civilian society and its loyalties. Mainstream historical fact: the Janissaries were unique among pre-modern military forces in that they were slaves of the Sultan, denied the right to marry or have families initially, which was intended to prevent divided loyalties and ensure their absolute devotion to the state. This rule was later relaxed, but the initial principle was crucial to their formation. Instructors use a variety of methods. Fear is a powerful tool. Punishments for minor infractions, a slow response, a missed prayer, a whispered word in your old language, are severe. Beatings are common. Food is withheld. Extra, grueling physical tasks are assigned. They break bonds between boys from the same village, scattering them into different training groups, preventing the formation of old allegiances. You learn quickly to trust no one fully except your immediate training cohort and ultimately the system itself. There's a quirky tidbit here. While harsh, the system wasn't universally cruel without purpose. The instructors, especially in the later, more specialized Janissary schools, were often highly skilled and sought to instill pride in the corps. There were opportunities for exceptional recruits to rise quickly. Some boys, having lost everything, found a strange sense of belonging and purpose in the rigid structure and camaraderie of the training barracks. It wasn't all bleak. For those who adapted, it was the foundation of a new, potentially powerful life. Think of it as toxic positivity meets extreme military discipline. Okay team, only 3 of you fainted today. Great job failing less than yesterday. This period of initial training, the Assemi-Olan phase, could last for several years. You might work on farms for 2 years, then spend another few years in the barracks learning military basics and religious doctrine. Only after proving your loyalty, discipline, and aptitude would you potentially be selected for entry into the prestigious Janissary Corps proper, or if you showed intellectual promise, the Palace School, Enderun, for administrative training. It was a long, arduous filter. Historians still argue whether the indoctrination was truly effective in erasing the recruits' original identities, or if it simply layered a new Ottoman Muslim identity on top of submerged memories and loyalties. Could a boy who spent his formative years as a Christian peasant truly become a fanatically loyal Muslim soldier with no lingering attachment to his past? The system certainly worked incredibly well for centuries, creating one of the most feared fighting forces in the world, but the human cost and the internal reality for the individual recruit remain subjects of complex debate. By the time you finish this initial training, you were no longer the boy who was taken from his village. You were tougher, leaner, fluent in Turkish, steeped in Islam, and conditioned to absolute obedience. You had survived the first crucial step. But surviving training was just the beginning. Now came the real test, life inside the Janissary Corps itself, and the constant specter of war. You've made it through the crucible. The Assemi-Olan years are behind you. You are now officially a Janissary. Your head is probably buzzing with Quranic verses and Turkish commands, and your body is a lean, hardened machine capable of enduring significant hardship. Where do you live now? In the Okak, the hearth, the barracks of the Janissary Corps, primarily located in and around Istanbul, the heart of the empire. This is your new home, your new family, your entire world. Imagine a vast complex of buildings, high walls, and numerous courtyards, bustling with thousands of soldiers. These weren't luxurious accommodations. Your living space is a large communal room shared with dozens, maybe even 100 of your fellow soldiers. Think of it as a perpetual, very crowded sleepover where everyone is incredibly disciplined and smells faintly of sweat and boiled lentils. You sleep on thin mats on the floor. Your personal possessions are minimal, maybe a small chest for clothes and a few letters if you're lucky enough to receive any, unlikely from your old family, remember. Privacy is still non-existent. Life in the barracks is governed by a strict, unyielding routine. Your day revolves around prayer, training, drills, maintenance of equipment, and communal meals. There's a rigid hierarchy. The AAA commander is at the top, followed by various officers and non-commissioned officers down to the rawest recruit. Discipline is paramount. A single misplaced word, a moment of insubordination or failure to follow orders could result in immediate harsh punishment. Remember that harsh discipline from training? It doesn't go away. It just becomes the baseline. The communal meals are a central part of barracks life and hold significant symbolic weight. The Janissaries were famously loyal to their kazan, cauldron, the large pot used to cook their food. The phrase overturning the cauldron was the traditional signal for a Janissary revolt or protest, a powerful symbol of their collective grievance and readiness to challenge authority. Mainstream historical fact, the Janissaries' loyalty was traditionally centered around their unit, their hearth, and their collective identity as servants of the Sultan, represented physically by the shared cooking pot. Mess time wasn't just eating, it was a ritual of solidarity. Your diet is simple, nutritious enough to keep you marching and fighting, but monotonous. Lots of boiled grains, lentils, occasional meat, bread, and maybe some vegetables or dried fruit when available. It's fuel, not fine dining. You eat together in silence or with minimal conversation, reinforcing the collective identity. Think of it as the original meal prep service, but the menu never changes and the chef is a guy who probably hates his job. Beyond the drills and meals, your time is spent maintaining your weapons and gear. Swords need sharpening, bows need restringing. Early firearms are notoriously finicky and require constant cleaning and care. If you were assigned to an artillery unit, the Topsu Corps, you'd be working with massive, complex cannons that were dangerous to operate and even more dangerous to be near when they fired. This wasn't just about keeping kit in order, it was about building familiarity and reliability with the tools of your deadly trade. One quirky tidbit about barracks life. Despite the strictness, Janissary barracks could also be centers of culture and community, albeit a very specific, insulated one. Janissaries developed their own slang, songs, and traditions. They valued literacy, and many could read and write, especially compared to the average peasant soldier of the time. Some barracks even had libraries. They were not just brutish soldiers. They were a highly organized, self-contained society with its own rules and norms. It's like a military fraternity, but instead of toga parties, you have intense religious study and potentially violent uprisings. Marriage and family were initially forbidden for Janissaries to ensure undivided loyalty. This rule softened over time, particularly as the Corps grew and its role evolved. By later centuries, many Janissaries did marry and live outside the barracks, sometimes even passing their position down to their sons, which fundamentally changed the nature of the Corps, often for the worse from the state's perspective. But in your early years, especially during the peak of the system, the Okak was your family. Your fellow soldiers were your brothers, bound by shared hardship, training, and loyalty to the Sultan. This lack of external family ties, while intended to increase loyalty to the Sultan, could also be incredibly isolating. You had no home to go back to, no wife or children waiting for you. Your entire identity was tied to the core. If you were injured or too old to serve, your future was uncertain. This constant dependence on the system fostered both fierce loyalty and, paradoxically, the potential for collective action and discontent when the system failed to provide. Historians still argue whether the increasing integration of janissaries into civilian life, including marriage and trade, fundamentally corrupted the core and led to its eventual decline, or if it was a natural evolution that the state failed to manage properly. Did allowing families make them less effective soldiers, or did state corruption and technological stagnation make the core obsolete regardless? It's a chicken and egg situation, but from your perspective, a young janissary in the barracks, it's all academic. Your reality is the never-ending drills, the bland food, the constant proximity to your comrades, and the ever-present understanding that at any moment the call could come to march, because sooner or later the Sultan would need his soldiers. All right, you're a lean, mean, Sultan-serving machine, fully integrated into the janissary Okak. Life in the barracks is strict but familiar. You know the routines, the faces, the taste of lentil soup, but the whole point of the janissary corps, the reason you were taken and trained, is war. And Ottoman wars meant marching, miles upon miles, across vast, varied, often hostile terrain. This wasn't a quick hop across the border. Campaigns could last for months, even years. Imagine the scene. Thousands of soldiers, infantry, cavalry, artillery, camp followers, servants, animals, horses, camels, oxen, even elephants sometimes, assembling outside Istanbul or another major city. The sheer scale of an Ottoman army on the move was staggering. This wasn't a paved road highway. This was often rough tracks, muddy fields, dusty plains, rocky mountain passes. You are part of this human river, flowing towards a distant, unknown destination. Your primary mode of transportation is your feet. You walk day after day through scorching summer heat that bakes the ground and turns dust into a choking cloud, through torrential rain that transforms tracks into muddy quagmires where you sink up to your ankles with every step, through the biting cold of early spring or late autumn with inadequate clothing and no shelter until you make camp. You carry your gear, your weapon, your minimal personal effects, probably part of a tent, maybe some shared cooking equipment. It's heavy. Your shoulders ache, your feet blister, and your muscles scream in protest. But you keep moving because everyone else is, and stopping means trouble. The pace is set by the army's needs, which often included hauling massive siege cannons and their ammunition. Try marching through the Balkans with a cannon the size of a small car. It slows things down considerably. A daily march might cover anywhere from 10 to 30 kilometers, depending on the terrain, the weather, and the need to keep the slower parts of the army together. That might not sound like much, but do it every day for weeks on end, carrying weight, and see how you feel. It's less of a march, more of a perpetual, low-grade agony. Finding water is a constant challenge. You rely on streams, rivers, and wells along the route. But imagine thousands of men and animals descending on a single water source. It quickly becomes polluted or depleted. Carrying enough water for a long march is impossible. You are dependent on what you can find. Thirst is a frequent companion, a dry ache in your throat that no amount of shallow breathing seems to fix. Setting up camp each night is another ordeal. Finding a suitable spot, erecting tents, digging latrines, hopefully, preparing food, maintaining weapons. It's a never-ending cycle of physical labor, even when you're not actively marching. Sleep is snatched in uncomfortable conditions, often exposed to the elements, with the constant noise of a massive encampment around you. Mainstream historical fact: Ottoman armies were renowned for their logistical complexity and ability to move huge numbers of men and materiel vast distances, a feat that often impressed or horrified their European contemporaries. They built roads, bridges, and way stations specifically for these campaigns. However, impressive logistical feat from a historical perspective often translates to utter misery for the individual foot soldier. There's a quirky tidbit about these marches. Sometimes, when passing through friendly or recently conquered territory, the army would be accompanied by musicians and standard bearers, making a grand spectacle. The initial departure from Istanbul could be a massive, impressive parade, a show of power and wealth for the populace. For the soldiers involved, however, this was just the fancy start to months of trudging, like putting a glittery bow on a brick and expecting someone to enjoy carrying it. Discipline on the march is strict. Straggling is not tolerated. Looting local villages without permission is severely punished, though it still happened. You are expected to maintain formation, respond to calls, and endure the hardship without complaint. The shared misery does create a strange form of camaraderie. You complain together, you share a last sip of water, you help a comrade who stumbles. These bonds forged on the road are as strong as those formed in the barracks. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on massive, slow-moving armies laden with heavy siege equipment ultimately became a strategic liability for the Ottomans in later centuries compared to faster, more mobile forces. Did their logistical strength become a weakness? From your perspective, trudging along with a piece of cannon ammunition strapped to a cart, it's less about grand strategy and more about whether your feet will make it to the next miserable waypoint. The endless march wasn't just travel, it was a grinding process that wore you down physically and mentally before you ever even saw the enemy. And that was just the beginning of the bad times. Okay, so you've marched for weeks, maybe months. Your feet feel like sacks of potatoes, your back aches, and you're pretty sure you've sweated out half your body weight. You've finally arrived somewhere vaguely near where the actual fighting might happen. Great. Time to rest and replenish, right? Nope. Now you get to deal with the glorious Ottoman military supply chain, or lack thereof, from your perspective on the ground. Feeding and equipping an army of tens or even hundreds of thousands of men and animals in the 15th to 18th centuries was a monumental task for any empire. The Ottomans were better at it than many, but better is a relative term when you're the one whose stomach is rumbling loud enough to wake the guy sleeping 10 feet away. You are constantly battling hunger and thirst. The official rations might be adequate on paper, but getting them reliably to every soldier, every single day, across vast distances and sometimes hostile territory was a logistical nightmare. Your standard ration might consist of hard biscuit, dried meat, lentils, rice, maybe some dried fruit or dates. Sounds rustic. It's designed for longevity, not taste or variety. This is supplemented by whatever can be bought or requisitioned locally, assuming you're in a place with resources and the army hasn't already stripped it bare. Imagine eating the same bland, dry food day in and day out for months. Your taste buds stage a full-scale rebellion. You dream of fresh bread, a juicy piece of fruit, anything that isn't hardtack and lentils. Water, as we touched on during the march, remains a critical issue. While marching, you're dependent on finding it. In camp, especially large, semi-permanent siege camps, the concentration of so many bodies quickly contaminates local water sources. Dysentery and other waterborne diseases spread like wildfire. More on disease, later joy. Sometimes water has to be transported, but that's a huge undertaking and never enough. You learn to ration every drop, to suppress the constant urge to drink. Beyond food and water, equipment is another headache. Your uniform is likely wool, hot in the summer, potentially inadequate in the bitter cold. Your boots wear out, and replacing them isn't easy. Your weapons and armor, while probably of decent quality initially if you're a janissary, suffer wear and tear. Maintenance is crucial, but spare parts or skilled repairmen are not always readily available. Imagine trying to fix your musket when a crucial spring breaks and you're miles from anywhere. You're suddenly very vulnerable. Mainstream historical fact: the Ottoman state invested heavily in supply infrastructure for its armies, including building granaries and depots along major campaign routes and organizing vast networks of suppliers and transporters. This was a key component of their military success for centuries. Yet, the system was vulnerable to corruption, enemy action, disease, and the sheer difficulty of managing distribution on such a scale. A quirky tidbit: Ottoman soldiers, especially the janissaries, were paid quarterly. This meant that during a long campaign, there could be significant gaps between paydays. To supplement their meager official rations and unreliable pay, soldiers often relied on plunder. This was a dangerous, officially discouraged, but widely practiced activity. Looting could get you killed if you were caught by your own officers or by angry locals. But the prospect of finding something valuable, food, money, goods, was a powerful motivator when you were hungry and broke. Think of it as a really high-stakes treasure hunt where the prize is a loaf of bread and the penalty is death. This reliance on unpredictable supplies and the need to forage or plunder creates a constant undercurrent of anxiety. You're not just worried about the enemy, you're worried about where your next meal is coming from. Will the supply train arrive? Will there be enough? Is that stream actually safe to drink from? Every day is a gamble against hunger, thirst, and illness. Historians still argue whether the increasing cost and difficulty of sustaining massive Ottoman armies on distant campaigns contributed significantly to the empire's military decline relative to European powers who were developing different logistical models. Were the Ottomans victims of their own earlier success, stuck with a system that couldn't adapt? Or were external factors like economic changes and technological shifts more important? For you, standing in a muddy camp with an empty stomach, the intellectual debate feels a bit distant. You just want dinner, and maybe a clean drink of water that doesn't taste faintly of, well, everything unpleasant that's happened upstream. Supply chain problems aren't just inconvenient for soldiers, they are fundamental threats to survival, arguably more consistently dangerous than the enemy's weapons. So you've endured the draft, the brutal training, the cramped barracks, the endless marches, and the questionable supply chain. Now you're getting closer to the sharp end of things. It's time to talk about the tools of your trade, your weapons and armor, and frankly, they add their own special layer of misery to the whole experience. As a janissary, you were equipped with a variety of weapons over the centuries. Initially, it might have been a composite bow, a formidable weapon in trained hands, capable of inflicting terrible damage at range. You might also have a sword or a curved saber, a dagger, and a shield. This was your standard kit for close combat and skirmishes. Learning to use these effectively takes years of practice, and even then, being good doesn't make you invincible. Swords clash, shields splinter, and arrows find gaps. It's a personal, terrifying form of violence. But the janissaries are most famous for adopting firearms relatively early compared to many other infantry units of the time. This was a significant technological leap, but early firearms were, let's just say, they had some teething problems. You're issued a musket or an arquebus depending on the era. It's heavy. The barrel gets incredibly hot after firing. It takes a frustratingly long time to reload. You have to pour black powder down the barrel, ram a musket ball or shot down on top of it, prime the pan with a pinch of powder, and then apply a match or flint to ignite it, all while people are actively trying to kill you. Try doing that in the rain, or with trembling hands, or with dust and debris flying everywhere. It's a recipe for misfires, hangfires, and general chaos. Mainstream historical fact: The Ottomans were pioneers in the adoption and use of gunpowder weapons, including early muskets and heavy artillery, which gave them a significant military advantage for a period. Imagine the noise when a line of these things goes off. A deafening roar, a cloud of acrid smoke, and a moment of terrifying uncertainty as you wait to see whose aim was true and whose weapon just went click. Then you have to go through the whole reloading process again. While you're reloading, you're incredibly vulnerable, basically standing there holding a heavy metal stick. This is where your sword or dagger comes in handy, just in case someone gets too close during your 30-second reload break. Your armor is designed to protect you, theoretically. Early on, you might have some form of mail or plate armor, maybe a helmet. As firearms became more common, heavy plate armor became less effective against musket balls, and soldiers often reduced their protection to make themselves lighter and more mobile. By the time of the musket, you might only have a helmet and maybe a reinforced coat or vest. It offers some protection against glancing blows or stray arrows, but a direct hit from a musket ball at range, not so much. It feels heavy and restrictive, limiting your movement and making you sweat profusely, but offers only marginal protection against the primary threats on the battlefield. It's like wearing a weighted blanket that also makes you a target. Operating these weapons effectively required intense training. You practiced firing your musket, learning to brace for the recoil, aiming, sort of, and mastering the complex reloading sequence under pressure. You practiced drill formations, learning to fire in volleys to create a continuous hail of lead, with the front rank firing and then retiring to reload while the next rank stepped up. This required immense discipline and coordination, especially with thousands of nervous men around you. A quirky tidbit, early janissaries, particularly those armed with bows, were incredibly skilled. Their composite bows had significant power and range. Some accounts suggest they could load and fire arrows faster and more accurately than early muskets could be reloaded and fired. This led to periods where armies struggled to decide whether the modern firearm was actually better than the traditional bow in all circumstances. It's a bit like arguing whether your flip phone is better than a smartphone because the battery lasts longer. Beyond your personal weapons, there's the artillery. If you were assigned to the Top Chu Artillery Corps, your life was dominated by massive cannons. These things were incredibly difficult to move, set up, and operate. Loading them involved heavy lifting and precise handling of gunpowder. Firing them was dangerous. Cannons could explode, injuring or killing the crew, and aiming them was an imprecise art. You were basically hoping to hit a large area or a fortification rather than a specific target. Working with artillery was dangerous, deafening, and often frustratingly slow. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman reliance on large, slow-moving artillery trains hindered their strategic flexibility in later periods compared to European armies developing lighter, more mobile field artillery. Did their mastery of siege warfare become a liability in open battles? From your position, trying to load a temperamental musket while keeping an eye out for charging enemy cavalry, the finer points of artillery doctrine feel less important than the fact that your weapon might just blow up in your face. The kit you carried was your lifeline, but it was heavy, unreliable, and only offered a fragile barrier against the overwhelming dangers of the battlefield. And the battlefield itself, that's where things really got bad. You've marched, you've endured the hunger, you've wrestled with your cumbersome, unreliable weapons. Now you stand on the edge of the battlefield. The air hums with nervous energy. The smell of thousands of bodies, animals, and wood smoke hangs heavy. Across the field, or over the ridge, or beyond the walls you're besieging, is the enemy. They look just as scared as you feel, probably. The drums start, the trumpets blare, the officers shout orders you barely hear over the rising din. This is it, the moment all that brutal training was for. And frankly, it's absolute chaos. Battle in this era was rarely the neat, orderly affair sometimes depicted in later paintings. It was a confusing, terrifying maelstrom of noise, violence, and panic. As a janissary, you might be positioned in the center of the Ottoman line, the core of the infantry. Your job is often to hold firm, absorbing enemy attacks or launching disciplined volleys of musket fire. If you're in the front ranks, you get the dubious honor of being the first to face the enemy's charge or their own missile fire. Arrows whiz past, muskets crackle, if they don't misfire, and cannonballs rip through the ranks with horrifying force, turning men into bloody paste. Imagine the noise, the shouts and screams, the roar of cannons, the rattle of muskets, the thud of hooves, the clang of steel on steel. It's deafening, disorienting. Orders are hard to hear. You're trying to reload your musket, keep your formation, watch for incoming threats, and keep your own panic in check all at once. It's less like a strategic maneuver and more like being stuck in the middle of a very violent, very loud mosh pit where everyone has weapons. Excuse me, could you stop stabbing me? I'm trying to reload here. If the enemy charges, especially heavy cavalry, it's a terrifying sight. Thousands of pounds of horse and rider, often armored, bearing down on your line. Your training kicks in. You brace yourself, perhaps firing a volley at close range, hoping to disorder their ranks, then drawing your sword or spear for the desperate melee. This is where individual courage and unit cohesion are tested to their absolute limit. The fighting becomes hand-to-hand, brutal, visceral. You're locked in personal combat, fighting for your life against someone who is trying just as hard to kill you. Mainstream historical fact. The Janissaries, particularly in their golden age, were renowned for their disciplined volley fire with muskets and their steadfastness in battle, often serving as the anchor of the Ottoman line against enemy cavalry and infantry. This tactical advantage, combined with effective artillery, made them a formidable force for centuries. However, battles weren't always glorious stands. Panic could spread quickly through crowded ranks. If one part of the line broke, it could cause a domino effect. Seeing your comrades cut down, hearing their screams, feeling the sheer pressure of the enemy assault, it takes incredible discipline not to turn and run. And running was often more dangerous than standing, as retreating soldiers were easy prey for cavalry. You were damned if you stood still, and damned if you ran away. A true lose-lose situation, or perhaps a lose slowly versus lose quickly option. Artillery fire was psychologically devastating, even if it wasn't always perfectly accurate. A cannonball plowing through a formation could kill or maim multiple men instantly. The unpredictable nature of these huge rounds, bouncing and rolling after impact, added to the terror. Even misses could kick up dirt and debris, disorienting soldiers. Siege warfare, too, involved constant exposure to enemy fire from fortifications, as well as the dangers of undermining walls or participating in costly assaults on breaches. Standing under a bombardment while hoping the wall collapses on the other guys is not great for the nerves. A quirky tidbit about Ottoman battles. The Sultan himself, or the Grand Vizier acting on his behalf, was often present at the battlefield, sometimes positioned prominently behind the Janissary lines. His presence was meant to inspire courage and loyalty, a physical representation of the authority you were fighting for. It also meant that if things went badly, the consequences for failure were immediate and severe, potentially for high-ranking officers. No pressure, just don't mess up while the boss is watching. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman military's adherence to set-piece battles with massive infantry blocks and heavy artillery ultimately made them predictable and vulnerable to more flexible European tactics in later centuries. Did their traditional strengths become exploitable weaknesses? Regardless of the grand strategy, for the individual soldier, the battlefield was a terrifying, chaotic place where survival was often a matter of luck, training, and the courage of the men standing next to you. If you survived the fighting, you still had to face the immediate aftermath, and that brought a whole new set of problems. So the battle is over. Maybe your side won, maybe it lost, maybe it was an indecisive, bloody mess. You're alive. Congratulations, you've cleared a statistically improbable hurdle, but now you have to deal with the cost of victory or defeat, the wounded. And if you're wounded yourself, well, things are about to get even less pleasant. Battlefield wounds were gruesome. Swords and sabers inflicted deep, bleeding cuts and hacking blows that could sever limbs. Arrows caused puncture wounds that could be difficult to remove and often became infected. Musket balls caused shattering bone damage and left dirty, potentially infected wounds. Cannonballs, as mentioned, were just catastrophic. You might survive being hit, but the resulting injury would likely be devastating. Medical care on the battlefield and in camp was, by modern standards, terrifyingly primitive. There were physicians and surgeons attached to the army, but their knowledge was limited and their tools were basic. Imagine being tended to in a chaotic, bloody field hospital, which was probably just a large tent or makeshift shelter, with inadequate light, questionable hygiene, and the sounds of agony all around you. It's not exactly a soothing environment. Treatments were brutal. For severe bleeding, they might try cauterization, burning the wound with a hot iron to stop the flow. Imagine the searing pain of that. Amputations were performed to prevent gangrene from spreading from badly mangled limbs. These were done without anesthetic, maybe a bit of alcohol or opium if you were lucky, but mostly nothing, with crude saws and knives. The shock and blood loss alone killed many patients, let alone the inevitable infection afterward. It was less surgery, more supervised butchery. Okay, hold still. This is going to sting a lot. Wounds were cleaned with whatever was available, which often meant contaminated water or even wine. Bandages were reused. Basic hygiene practices were poorly understood. As a result, infection was rampant. A seemingly minor wound could fester, turn gangrenous, and kill you slowly and painfully over days or weeks. Surviving the initial injury was often just the first step in a death sentence by infection. Mainstream historical fact. While the Ottoman Empire had a tradition of medical scholarship and hospitals, like the Darüşşifa complexes, battlefield medicine remained incredibly challenging and primitive, similar to conditions faced by soldiers in European armies of the same period. Infection and complications from injuries were far more common causes of death than being killed outright in combat. If you weren't personally wounded, you might be tasked with helping carry the injured to the field hospital or burying the dead. This was a grim, exhausting job, exposing you to the full horror of the battle's aftermath. The sights, the smells, the sounds of suffering, they leave their own kind of wound, and you had to do it quickly because the army often needed to march again soon. A quirky tidbit: Ottoman military medicine did have some interesting practices, including the use of herbal remedies and techniques passed down through generations. Some surgeons were highly skilled for their time, capable of complex procedures. However, the sheer scale of casualties, the lack of understanding of germ theory, and the harsh campaigning conditions severely limited their effectiveness. It's like trying to perform open-heart surgery with a butter knife and some nice-smelling herbs. Historians still argue whether the high rates of death from disease and untreated wounds in Ottoman armies, compared to direct combat fatalities, were primarily due to limitations inherent in pre-modern medicine or exacerbated by specific Ottoman logistical and hygiene practices in large camps. Was it just the era, or were specific aspects of Ottoman campaigning making things worse? From your perspective, clutching a bloody bandage and trying not to scream, the distinction probably seems pretty academic. You're just hoping you don't get the fever and that whoever is patching you up doesn't make it worse. Surviving the battle was hard enough. Surviving the aftermath felt like a whole other war. You faced the enemy's weapons and survived the gruesome aftermath of battle and its primitive medical care. You might think the fighting was the most dangerous part of being an Ottoman soldier. You'd be wrong. Statistically, your greatest enemy wasn't a charging knight or a musket ball with your name on it. It was something microscopic, silent, and absolutely devastating: disease. Standing shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other men in cramped barracks, or worse, massive unsanitary campaign camps, was a perfect breeding ground for illness. Hygiene was rudimentary at best. Latrines, if dug at all, were often overflowing pits located too close to water sources. Clean water was a luxury. Food storage was imperfect, leading to spoilage. Add to this the stress, fatigue, and malnutrition from the endless marches and unreliable supplies, and you have an army of walking immune systems ready to collapse. Camp fever, dysentery, smallpox, typhus, and the dreaded plague were constant companions of any large army on campaign. Dysentery, caused by contaminated food or water, was particularly common and debilitating. It would spread rapidly through the camp, leaving men weak, dehydrated, and often leading to a slow, miserable death. You'd see healthy comrades suddenly struck down, suffering terribly, and there was little anyone could do to help them. The plague, when it struck, was the most terrifying. Carried by fleas on rats or spread human to human depending on the type, it could decimate an army in weeks. Soldiers would develop painful swellings, bubonic plague, or cough up blood, pneumonic plague, dying quickly and horribly. Panic would sweep through the ranks. There was no effective treatment, only quarantine, often impossible in a military camp, or prayer. Seeing men who were healthy yesterday dead today, their bodies covered in terrible signs of the disease, was a constant, horrifying reality. Mainstream historical fact: disease was the single biggest killer in pre-modern armies, routinely accounting for far more fatalities than combat itself. Ottoman armies, despite their logistical strengths, were just as vulnerable to the ravages of epidemic disease as their European counterparts. Think about it. Thousands of people from different regions exposed to local pathogens they had no immunity to, living in close proximity under constant stress with poor sanitation and nutrition. It was a perfect storm for disease outbreaks. An army could arrive at a siege site strong and ready to fight, only to be rendered ineffective within weeks by a rampant epidemic. Whole units could be wiped out without ever seeing the enemy. It's like being signed up for a deadly sports tournament where half the players are secretly infected with super flu. Great game, guys, half the team is dead, but hey, we didn't technically lose on the field. A quirky tidbit: there are accounts of Ottoman authorities attempting measures to combat disease, such as moving camps frequently to avoid built-up filth, isolating the sick when possible, and boiling water, though the reason why this helped wasn't understood. They just knew it sometimes seemed to work. However, these efforts were often insufficient against the scale and nature of the epidemics they faced. It was like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. The constant threat of illness added another layer of psychological burden. You weren't just worried about getting shot or stabbed. You were worried about waking up with the fever, the aches, the terrible symptoms that meant you were likely doomed. You'd see your friends sicken and die, not with the dramatic finality of battle, but with a drawn-out, pathetic suffering. It eroded morale and added to the general misery of camp life. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates from disease in Ottoman campaigns significantly impacted their long-term military effectiveness and strategic decision-making. Did the fear and reality of epidemic force them to shorten campaigns or avoid certain areas? Or was it simply an unavoidable factor of warfare in that era for everyone? For you, feeling that first chill or the telltale cramp, the historical debate is moot. You're just hoping it's not what you think it is, knowing deep down it probably is. The invisible enemy was often the most terrifying and the hardest to fight. All right, you've somehow survived the march, the battle, the dubious medical care, and the even more dangerous threat of disease. You've earned your keep, served the Sultan, endured hardships most civilians couldn't imagine. Surely, now it's time for your reward. Time for that reliable income that allows you to live with some dignity? Well, about that, let's talk about Ottoman soldier pay. As a janissary, you were officially a salaried soldier paid 4 times a year, quarterly, in coin. Sounds promising, right? The reality was often far less consistent. Paydays could be delayed for months, especially when the army was on a long campaign far from the imperial treasury in Istanbul. Imagine being in the middle of nowhere, hungry, tired, and realizing you haven't been paid in 6 months. Your official rations are meager, and you can't buy extra food or supplies because you have no money. It adds a significant financial strain on top of all the physical and psychological burdens. The value of your pay could also fluctuate. The Ottoman currency could be devalued by the state, meaning the coins you received were worth less than they were supposed to be, eroding your purchasing power. This was a frequent source of grievance among the janissaries and other paid troops. You might be getting the same number of coins, but if those coins buy half as much bread or cloth, you're effectively getting a pay cut. It's like your boss giving you the same salary, but switching it from dollars to Zimbabwean dollars overnight. Awkward. To supplement their unreliable official pay and rations, soldiers often resorted to unofficial means. We already touched on plunder during campaigns, taking goods, money, or livestock from conquered territories or even enemy camps. This was risky, but potentially lucrative. If you managed to get back to camp or a town with loot, you might be able to sell it or trade it for things you needed. It was a dangerous game of chance, but sometimes necessary for survival. Mainstream historical fact: the janissaries were a paid infantry corps, receiving salaries from the central treasury. However, delays in payment and the devaluation of currency were recurring issues throughout Ottoman history, often leading to discontent and even mutiny among the troops. Janissaries in later periods, particularly those stationed in cities during peacetime, often engaged in trades and crafts to supplement their income. They might run shops, work as butchers, or engage in other forms of business. While this helped their financial situation, it also drew them away from constant military readiness and blurred the lines between soldier and civilian, contributing to changes in the corps' nature. Imagine your elite feared soldier spending his days haggling over spices in the market. "Yes, Sultan, I'm ready to march. Just let me finish this transaction for cumin." The expectation of plunder could also incentivize troops to push for campaigns against wealthy targets or to prioritize looting over military objectives. If the army was fighting in poor, depleted territory, morale could drop significantly because there was little prospect of supplementing their income through unofficial means. The soldiers weren't just fighting for the Sultan's glory, they were fighting, in part, for their own economic survival. A quirky tidbit about pay. When janissaries received their pay, it was sometimes distributed in a formal ceremony called the Ulufe Divani. This public event was a display of the Sultan's generosity and the soldiers' dependence on him. However, if the pay was late or perceived as insufficient, these ceremonies could become tense affairs, sometimes leading to open protests or demands. It was a performance of power, but one that could quickly go sour if the audience wasn't happy with the performance. Historians still argue whether the financial strain on the Ottoman treasury caused by maintaining a large paid army like the janissaries and the associated issues of delayed pay and devaluation was a major factor in the empire's long-term economic and military difficulties. Did the cost of their elite corps become unsustainable? For you, trying to decide whether to risk getting caught looting a chicken or just go hungry for the night, the high-level economic policy feels somewhat distant. You just want to get paid on time in coins that are actually worth something. The unreliability of your income added a layer of constant stress and forced you into risky behaviors just to make ends meet. So you've endured the endless discomforts, faced down death by blade, bullet, and bug, and wrestled with an empty wallet and an emptier stomach. Through it all, one thing remains constant: The iron fist of military discipline. Life in the Ottoman army, whether you were a janissary or a regular recruit, was governed by incredibly strict rules, and breaking them came with consequences that ranged from merely painful to absolutely final. Imagine a system where disobedience isn't just a demerit, it's potentially treason. Your life, your loyalty, your very being belongs to the Sultan and the state. Any action that undermines that is seen as a fundamental threat. Discipline was enforced through a clear hierarchy, from your immediate non-commissioned officers all the way up to the Am-e-ah. They had immense power over your day-to-day existence, and they weren't afraid to use it. Punishments for minor infractions could include public humiliation, extra grueling duties, or physical beatings with sticks or whips. Forget to clean your musket properly? Get ready for aching muscles and stinging welts. Caught sleeping on guard duty? That's significantly worse, potentially even a death sentence depending on the situation. Talking back to an officer, gambling when forbidden, fighting with a comrade, outside of official training bouts obviously, all these could land you in serious trouble. It's less like detention and more like facing a medieval HR department with a penchant for corporal punishment. So, you were late? Let's discuss your performance review. And by discuss, I mean beat you senseless. More serious offenses brought swift, brutal, and often public retribution. Desertion, theft from fellow soldiers or civilians, unless sanctioned plunder, of course, mutiny, or even just inciting unrest, striking an officer, these were capital crimes. Execution wasn't just a penalty, it was a deterrent, a stark message to the rest of the army about the cost of stepping out of line. Executions could be carried out in various ways, often designed to maximize the spectacle and terror. Beheading was common. Sometimes soldiers were impaled, a particularly gruesome method. For naval personnel or those near water, drowning was a possibility. Imagine being forced to watch a comrade who tried to desert facing such a fate. It was a powerful, sickening reminder of the absolute authority wielded by the state and its officers. Mainstream historical fact. Harsh discipline, including severe corporal punishment and execution for a wide range of offenses, was a characteristic of most pre-modern armies, including the Ottoman forces. It was considered necessary to maintain order, obedience, and cohesion among large bodies of potentially unruly men. While official rules were incredibly strict, the enforcement could sometimes vary depending on the officer, the situation, and the overall morale of the troops. A popular commander might be more lenient, while a disliked one might rule with an iron fist. During periods of high tension or discontent, officers might be hesitant to impose the harshest penalties for fear of sparking a larger uprising. Remember the potential for the janissaries to overturn the cauldron. This created a strange dynamic where the feared elite soldiers could sometimes leverage their collective power against individual disciplinary actions, a delicate balance that wasn't always respected. A quirky tidbit. Janissaries had their own internal disciplinary codes and even their own courts for dealing with minor infractions within the corps. This reflected their semi-autonomous status within the military structure. While major crimes still fell under the jurisdiction of state law and higher military command, some day-to-day issues were handled internally. It was like a military frat house with its own judiciary system, except the worst penalty wasn't getting kicked out. It was getting flogged by your brothers. The constant threat of severe punishment instilled a deep-seated caution and a learned obedience. You didn't question orders, you didn't complain too loudly, and you certainly didn't step out of line when an officer was watching. This discipline was essential for the functioning of large, complex armies on campaign, allowing for coordinated movements and actions under pressure. But it came at a significant human cost, creating an environment of fear that permeated daily life. Historians still argue whether the increasing brutality of discipline in the later centuries of the Ottoman Empire reflected a decline in the intrinsic loyalty of the soldiers or was a reaction by the state to perceived challenges to its authority, particularly from the increasingly powerful Janissary corps. Was harshness a sign of strength or weakness? From your perspective, watching a comrade being tied to a post, the academic analysis feels a long way off. All you know is you need to keep your head down, follow the rules, and hope you don't make a mistake that costs you everything. Discipline wasn't just about order, it was about survival in a system that demanded absolute conformity, enforced by the ever-present possibility of extreme penalty. Assuming you survived battle, disease, starvation, and the quartermaster's questionable arithmetic, you might find yourself assigned to garrison duty. This isn't the glorious front lines you might have imagined during your training. This is life on the frontier, holding a fortification or manning a remote outpost in newly conquered or contested territory. And let me tell you, it had its own special brand of misery. Imagine being stationed in a dusty, isolated fort miles from any major city. Your job is to maintain a presence, deter raids, and potentially engage in skirmishes with local resistance or the forces of neighboring states. The pace of life is slower than on campaign, but it's also monotonous and fraught with a different kind of tension. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, often with nothing happening except routine patrols, maintenance, and the crushing boredom of being stuck in the middle of nowhere. It's like being sent to military Siberia, but hotter and with more scorpions. The fortifications themselves could range from impressive stone castles to hastily built palisades. Regardless, they were often uncomfortable places to live. Cramped quarters, poor sanitation, dampness, or excessive heat depending on the climate, and the constant smell of stale cooking and unwashed bodies. You're still living communally, just in a different, potentially more defensible, box. Your duty involves standing watch, maintaining the fort's defenses, practicing drills, if you're lucky enough to have competent officers who bother, and patrolling the surrounding territory. Patrols could be dangerous, exposing you to ambushes from local insurgents or enemy scouts. You might go for days or weeks without incident, only to suddenly find yourself in a deadly skirmish far from the safety of the walls. It's the kind of waiting game that grates on your nerves, punctuated by moments of sudden, violent terror. Supplies in frontier garrisons could be even more unreliable than on campaign. You might be dependent on caravans arriving periodically from larger centers, caravans that could be delayed, attacked, or simply fail to bring everything you need. Shortages of food, water, ammunition, or even basic medical supplies were common. You often had to live off the land to some extent, foraging or trading with nearby, hopefully friendly villages, adding uncertainty to your daily existence. Mainstream historical fact. Maintaining a network of garrisons along its vast borders was essential for the Ottoman Empire's control over its territories and for projecting power. Soldiers stationed in these remote outposts played a crucial role in consolidating conquests and defending against incursions. The isolation of frontier duty could be incredibly hard psychologically. You were far from the centers of the empire, far from the excitement and potential plunder of major campaigns, and far from any chance of a normal civilian life. Communication with the outside world was slow and infrequent. You felt forgotten, stuck in a static, dangerous environment. It's like being on a permanent, low-budget reality show called Fort Watchers, where nothing happens for weeks and then suddenly everyone tries to kill you. A quirky tidbit. Soldiers in remote garrisons sometimes developed surprisingly close relationships with local populations, particularly if the area had been under Ottoman rule for a long time and tensions had eased. They might trade, socialize, and even form relationships, despite the initial context of conquest. This blurred the lines of military occupation and sometimes led to garrisons becoming integrated into the local community, which could be both a source of stability and occasionally conflicting loyalties. Historians still argue whether the long-term effectiveness of Ottoman frontier garrisons declined over time due to issues like corruption, inadequate supplies, lack of training, and the increasing integration of soldiers into local economies, making them less focused on military duties. Did garrison life domesticate the soldiers too much? From your perspective, staring out from a watchtower at an empty horizon, the historical debate about declining effectiveness feels less important than whether the supply caravan is going to show up this month or if you're going to be eating roots again. The monotony and quiet danger of the frontier was a different kind of suck compared to the battlefield, but for those who lived it for years, it was arguably more soul-crushing. Up to this point, we've focused primarily on the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps formed through the Devshirme, but they weren't the only type of soldier in the vast Ottoman army. Another crucial component was the Sipahi, or Spahi, the feudal cavalry. And while their experience was different from yours as a Janissary, it had its own unique set of challenges and, yes, its own particular forms of suck. Sipahis were cavalrymen granted land holdings called taimars, or zaims and has for larger holdings, by the Sultan in exchange for military service. They were responsible for maintaining order in their taimar, collecting taxes from the peasants living on the land, and, most importantly, presenting themselves for military service when summoned, bringing with them a certain number of armed and equipped retainers called sebelu, based on the size and income of their land grant. Think of them as knight equivalents, managing a small fiefdom in exchange for being ready to fight. Your experience as a Sipahi recruit would be different from the Devshirme. You were probably born into a family with an existing taimar grant. Your training would focus on horsemanship, archery from horseback. The Ottomans were masterful horse archers, lances, swords, and cavalry tactics. You were part of the feudal military aristocracy, with a higher social status than a janissary, at least initially. But this system came with significant burdens. Your income and status were tied directly to your land grant. If you failed to perform your military duty, or if the Sultan revoked your taimar for any reason, disfavor, poor performance, rebellion, you lost everything. This created a constant pressure to show up when called, equipped, and ready, even if it meant hardship. Imagine receiving the call to arms. You have to mobilize yourself, gather your required sebelu, who might be peasants you've armed and trained, or professional retainers if you're wealthy enough, equip everyone and march to the designated assembly point, often at your own expense or using the income from your taimar. This could be a significant financial strain, especially for smaller taimar holders. You were essentially self-funded warriors, expected to provide a service based on the wealth generated by your land. It's like being a freelance warrior where your payment is a farm, and you have to pay your own travel expenses to get to the gig. All right, team, the boss needs us in Hungary. Pack your bags and your pitchforks, and maybe bring some snacks. I'm a bit short on taimar income this quarter. On campaign, Sipahis were the eyes and ears of the army, performing reconnaissance, raiding enemy territory, and engaging enemy cavalry. In battle, they delivered shock charges, harassing enemy flanks or pursuing fleeing foes. Their life on campaign involved dealing with horses, feeding them, caring for them, losing them in battle, a constant, expensive responsibility. Cavalry life is hard on horses, and horses were valuable. Mainstream historical fact. The Sipahi system was the backbone of the early Ottoman military, providing the empire with large numbers of well-trained cavalry. The taimar system allowed the state to mobilize significant forces without a large standing army paid directly from the central treasury, distributing the cost of warfare across the land. However, the Sipahi system had its weaknesses. Sipahi forces could be slower to mobilize than the standing army, as they had to gather from their various land holdings. The quality and number of sebelu they brought could vary. As military technology changed, particularly with the rise of effective gunpowder infantry like the Janissaries, the relative importance and effectiveness of the Sipahi cavalry in set-piece battles declined, though they remained crucial for other tasks. A quirky tidbit about Sipahis. There were often rivalries and tensions between the Sipahis and the Janissaries. The Sipahis saw themselves as the traditional noble military class, while the Janissaries were slaves of the Sultan, even though they were the elite modern infantry. These tensions sometimes flared into open conflict or political maneuvering, adding another layer of internal complexity to the Ottoman military structure. It was like a centuries-long feud between the jocks and the nerds, but the jocks had horses and swords and the nerds had muskets and gunpowder. Historians still argue whether the decline of the Timar system and the decreasing military effectiveness of the Sipahis were primarily due to internal corruption and mismanagement of the land grants, the changing nature of warfare favoring infantry and artillery, or economic shifts that made land-based wealth less dominant. Was the Sipahi system a victim of its own success or external changes? For you, a Sipahi worried about affording replacement armor after a tough skirmish, or trying to collect taxes from grumpy peasants back home, the specific reasons for the system's eventual decline feel less pressing than the immediate burdens of your duty and the constant pressure to justify your land grant. You've spent your youth and prime years in the service of the Sultan, enduring hardships that would break most people. You've marched across empires, faced down enemies, survived disease, navigated the internal politics of the core, and somehow, against the odds, you've reached an age where your body isn't quite as capable as it once was. You're thinking about retirement. What does life look like for an Ottoman military veteran? Often, it was a bleak farewell. Unlike some modern armies, the Ottoman system, particularly in its earlier centuries, didn't have a well-developed, reliable pension system for rank-and-file soldiers. Your service entitled you to your pay while you were fit to fight, and potentially a share of plunder, but there wasn't a guaranteed safety net for old age or debilitating injury. If you were a Janissary, especially in the later periods when the rules against marriage were relaxed, you might have a family or have established a trade in a city. This provided a potential support system. You might continue living in or near the barracks, perhaps doing light duties or using your status to engage in commerce. But if you were severely wounded, unable to work, and lacked family support, your prospects were grim. There wasn't a veterans hospital waiting to take care of you or a disability pension to fall back on. You might be left to rely on charity, the kindness of former comrades, or whatever meager savings you managed to accumulate, unlikely given the pay issues we discussed. For Sipahis, the situation was slightly different, but also precarious. Your pension was essentially your Timar land grant. As long as you were able to perform your military service when called, or send a capable substitute, you could continue to benefit from the income of your land. However, if you became too old or infirm to serve and had no suitable heir or retainer to fulfill your obligation, the Timar could be revoked by the state. Losing your land meant losing your livelihood, your home, and your social status all at once. It was a harsh system that demanded continuous service or the provision of service through others. It's like working for a company where your retirement plan is owning the office building, but if you stop showing up, they take the building back. Thanks for 40 years. Here's your eviction notice. Mainstream historical fact. While the Ottoman state did provide some forms of support for wounded or elderly soldiers, particularly those who had served with distinction or held higher ranks, there was no universal, reliable pension or social security system for the majority of common soldiers, leaving many vulnerable in old age or after debilitating injuries. The lack of a secure future after service meant that soldiers often had to think about how to provide for themselves later in life while they were still serving. This contributed to the desire for plunder, the engagement in trades by urban janissaries, and the Sipahis' focus on maintaining control of their Taimars. Your military service was not just a job. It was hopefully a means to acquire something that could sustain you when you were no longer able to swing a sword or aim a musket. A quirky tidbit. Some older respected janissaries or Sipahis might be given less physically demanding roles, like garrison duty in less volatile areas or administrative positions within the corps, allowing them to continue earning income and maintain status. This wasn't a formal pension, but rather a way to utilize their experience while accommodating their age or injuries. It was like getting moved from the front lines to the mailroom, but the mailroom still occasionally got attacked. Historians still argue whether the lack of a robust veteran support system contributed to issues like corruption within the military, as soldiers sought to enrich themselves while they could, or made military service less attractive over time compared to other potential avenues of advancement in Ottoman society. Did the state's failure to care for its veterans ultimately weaken the military? From your perspective, watching younger, fitter men take your place in the ranks and wondering how you'll get by now that your body is broken, the historical analysis of contributing factors feels less important than the very real prospect of poverty and neglect. Surviving the army was an achievement in itself, but surviving after the army presented a whole new, equally daunting set of challenges. You've heard about the physical hardships, the brutal training, the chaos of battle, the scourge of disease, the financial precarity, the harsh discipline, the boredom of garrison life, and the uncertain fate of veterans. All these external pressures take their toll, but perhaps the most profound and lasting impact of being an Ottoman soldier, especially one brought up through the Dev Sherm system, was the psychological price you paid. Imagine being taken from your home as a child, stripped of your name, your family, your religion, your language, and everything familiar. You were deliberately alienated from your past and immersed in a new, demanding, and often brutal world. This process, while intended to create loyal soldiers, was inherently traumatic. You were forced to suppress your former identity, to become someone new, forged in the crucible of military training and indoctrination. Life in the barracks and on campaign offered camaraderie, yes, a brotherhood forged in shared hardship, but it also involved constant exposure to violence, death, and suffering. You saw friends killed in combat, succumb to horrific diseases, or face brutal punishments. You witnessed the atrocities of war, whether committed by the enemy or your own side during plunder or suppression of dissent. These experiences leave deep scars on the psyche. The constant state of alert, the fear of death or injury, the uncertainty of supply and pay, it's a relentless stream of stress that wears you down. You were trained to be a professional killer, to suppress empathy for the enemy, to follow orders that might involve acts you found disturbing. While the indoctrination was strong, the human cost of such a life is immense. You lived in a world where violence was commonplace, death was a constant companion, and your own life was cheap in the service of the state. Mainstream historical fact. Military service, particularly in pre-modern warfare, with its close quarters combat and lack of psychological understanding, had significant and lasting psychological impacts on soldiers, although these effects were rarely documented or addressed in ways we would recognize today. The isolation from civilian life, particularly for janissaries in their prime, meant that the military became your entire world. You lost touch with civilian norms, rhythms, and relationships. Reintegrating into society, if you even had the chance later in life, could be incredibly difficult. Your experiences, your mindset, were fundamentally different from those who had lived civilian lives. You were trained to obey, to fight, to endure hardship, not necessarily to build a quiet life in a village or city. A quirky tidbit. While modern terms like PTSD didn't exist, Historical accounts sometimes describe soldiers suffering from what sounds like combat trauma, shaking, inability to sleep, nightmares, extreme nervousness, or sudden violent outbursts. These weren't seen as psychological conditions, but perhaps as weakness, cowardice, or demonic possession, leading to further suffering for the affected soldier. It's like going through something horrific and then being told you're just being dramatic or are literally evil. Historians still argue about the extent to which the psychological impact of military service, particularly the Devshirme process and constant warfare, shaped the behavior of soldiers like the Janissaries outside of combat. Did their trauma contribute to their sometimes volatile behavior and involvement in political unrest? Or were these actions driven more by economic and political factors? The human mind is complex, and the weight of such experiences must have been immense, even if historical sources don't describe it in clinical terms. From being snatched as a child, to the relentless training that broke your old self, to the daily grind of hardship, the terror of battle, the vulnerability to disease, the indignity of unreliable pay, the fear of brutal discipline, the monotony of the frontier, the burden of the Sipahi's land, and the bleak prospects of old age. Life as an Ottoman soldier was a continuous exercise in enduring profound discomfort, danger, and psychological strain. It was a life dedicated entirely to the Sultan and the state, a life that demanded everything and offered survival, status, and occasional reward in return, but at a cost that went far beyond the physical. You were a finely tuned instrument of war, but the process of building that instrument often shattered the person underneath. And now, as the echoes of the past begin to fade, feel yourself drifting away from the dusty plains and crowded barracks. The sounds of the camp are softening, the clang of armor, the distant shouts, the low murmur of thousands of voices, fading now. The smell of wood smoke and damp wool is becoming fainter, replaced by the familiar, comforting scent of your own space. You're no longer trudging through mud or standing watch in the cold night air. The weight of the musket, the bite of ill-fitting armor, the ache in your bones, they are lessening. Your breath is slowing, evening out. The anxieties of the battlefield, the fear of the draft, the uncertainty of the next day, let them recede like the tide. You are safe now, here, in your own time, in your own bed. The soldiers of empires past have finished their watch for the night. Their struggles are history, and your journey through it is complete. Rest now. You've earned it.